You are 14 years old, and the air in the sealed palanquin is thick with the scent of silk and your own fear. Outside, the Forbidden City hums with a power you can only imagine, a world of jade, lacquer, and whispered sentences that can end a life. You are no longer a person. You are a vessel, a potential mother to an emperor's son. This is the secret life of a Chinese concubine, a gilded cage where beauty is a weapon and survival is an art form. The journey to this suffocating box began in the soft, misty hills of the south, a lifetime ago. You were once called Lin, a name as common as the wildflowers that grew by the river near your home. You were the daughter of a minor official, a man whose ambition was a quiet, persistent ache. He saw in your youthful face, in the curve of your brow and the delicate line of your jaw, not a child to be cherished, but a key. A key that could unlock the gates to a world of influence and imperial favor he could only dream of. The day the imperial eunuchs arrived was a day of strange, conflicting emotions. Your village, a place of predictable rhythms and familiar faces, was thrown into a state of suspended animation. The arrival of the emperor's messengers was an honor, a terrifying, paralyzing honor. They moved with a chilling grace, their faces smooth, impassive masks that betrayed nothing. They were the system's enforcers, men who had sacrificed their own manhood to serve the ultimate patriarch, the Son of Heaven. Their eyes, devoid of personal desire, were instruments of cold, objective assessment. They examined you not as a man examines a woman, but as a merchant appraises a rare piece of porcelain. Your teeth, your hair, the texture of your skin, the length of your fingers, even the sound of your voice, every part of you was catalogued, judged against an unseen, unforgiving standard. Your father, usually a man of stern composure, trembled as he offered them tea, his hands shaking so badly the cups rattled in their saucers. He was a complicit enforcer in his own right, sacrificing his daughter to the altar of his own aspirations. You were chosen. The word echoed in the sudden silence of your home, a death knell disguised as a proclamation of glory. Your mother wept, but her tears were a complex cocktail of pride and a deep, instinctual grief she could never voice. She knew, as all women knew, what this honor truly meant. It was an erasure. You would be taken from them, your name stripped away, your past severed like a thread. You would become a creature of the palace, a numbered, ranked ornament in the emperor's vast collection. The preparations were a blur of activity, a frantic attempt to polish the sacrificial offering. You were bathed in milk and honey, your skin scrubbed until it was raw, your hair combed and scented with jasmine. You were taught the intricate rituals of palace etiquette, how to walk, how to speak, how to bow, how to pour tea, how to make your body a pliant, pleasing instrument. It was a systematic dehumanization, a chipping away of the girl you were to make way for the concubine you had to become. The hollow dread that had settled in your stomach like a stone on the day of your selection had now become a permanent resident, a cold companion in your new gilded reality. As you stepped into the palanquin, leaving behind the only world you had ever known, you did not look back. To look back was to acknowledge the loss, and the first rule of survival in the Forbidden City was to feel nothing at all. The Forbidden City was not a city, it was a universe unto itself, a sprawling labyrinth of courtyards, halls, and gardens, all governed by a rigid, suffocating order. The air itself seemed different here, heavy with the weight of history, intrigue, and unspoken desires. Upon your arrival, you and the other chosen girls were led through a series of gates, each one taking you deeper into the heart of this magnificent prison. You were assigned to a small Spartan room in the Palace of Gathered Elegance, a name so cruelly ironic it felt like a deliberate taunt. Here, you were no longer Lin. You were given a new name, Maying, meaning beautiful flower, a label that defined your singular purpose. You were now a talented lady, one of the lowest ranks of imperial concubines, a seedling in a vast, competitive garden, hoping to catch a single ray of the imperial sun. The initial months were a period of intense, relentless training. Under the watchful eyes of senior eunuchs and palace matrons, you learned the arts expected of an imperial woman. Calligraphy, painting, music, and the complex game of Go were drilled into you, not for your own enrichment, but to make you a more pleasing diversion for the emperor. Your education was a form of psychological warfare. You were taught the histories of past dynasties, with a particular focus on the fates of concubines who had displeased the emperor or fallen victim to the schemes of their rivals. These were not lessons, they were warnings, cautionary tales woven into the fabric of your daily existence. You learned of Empress Lu, whose jealousy led her to mutilate her rival, the consort Qi, turning her into a human pig. You heard whispers of concubines poisoned, strangled, or forced to commit suicide, their names and stories becoming ghosts that haunted the palace corridors. The complicit system enforcers were everywhere. The eunuchs, with their high-pitched voices and gliding steps, were the eyes and ears of the emperor, their loyalty absolute, their methods ruthless. They controlled every aspect of your life, from the food you ate to the clothes you wore. They were the arbiters of favor, the gatekeepers to the emperor's bedchamber, and their smiles were as dangerous as their frowns. The older concubines, women who had survived years in this treacherous environment, were another source of constant, low-grade terror. They saw you and the other new arrivals not as sisters in shared captivity, but as fresh threats, new rivals in the zero-sum game of imperial favor. Their kindness was a mask, their advice a potential trap. They taught you the art of insinuation, the language of veiled threats, and the importance of forging alliances, however temporary and fragile. You learned to read the subtle shifts in the palace's social climate, to discern who was in favor and who was not, to navigate the treacherous currents of jealousy and ambition that flowed through every courtyard and corridor. The loneliness was a physical presence, a constant ache in your chest. You were surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, your thoughts and fears your only true companions. The struggle was to maintain a sense of self, to hold on to the memory of the girl named Lin, against the overwhelming force of the system designed to erase her. Your fate, you quickly realized, was not your own. It belonged to the dysfunctional tyrant at the center of this universe, a man you had never even seen. The Emperor, the Son of Heaven, was less a man and more a myth, a distant, all-powerful deity whose moods dictated the weather of the entire Forbidden City. In your first year, you did not see him once. You heard of his visits to other palaces, of the lanterns lit for his arrival, of the sounds of music and celebration that drifted over the high walls, a constant reminder of your own irrelevance. He was the Jiajing Emperor, a man whose reign was marked by a deep and corrosive paranoia. He had ascended the throne as a teenager, and the years had twisted his initial insecurity into a full-blown political psychosis. He trusted no one, seeing assassins and conspirators in every shadow. His obsession was not with governance, but with a desperate, all-consuming quest for immortality. This fixation had turned the palace into a laboratory for his bizarre and often lethal alchemical experiments. Taoist priests and mystics, with their promises of elixirs and magical pills, had become his most trusted advisors, their influence eclipsing that of his ministers and generals. The court was rife with their strange rituals, the air often thick with the smoke of burning herbs and the cloying scent of strange concoctions. This was the dysfunctional tyrant you were meant to please, a man whose mind was a labyrinth of fear and esoteric fantasy. Your first encounter with him was as anticlimactic as it was terrifying. You were not chosen for his bed, but to serve him during a banquet. Along with a dozen other low-ranking concubines, you knelt on the polished floor, your head bowed, your hands steady as you offered him wine in a jade cup. You dared not look at his face, but you could feel his presence, a palpable aura of absolute power and simmering instability. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly soft, yet it carried an edge of capricious cruelty that made the hairs on your arm stand on end. He spoke not to his ministers about matters of state, but to his Taoist advisors about the sourcing of rare minerals for his elixirs. He was a man entirely consumed by his own internal world. The vast empire he ruled a mere backdrop to his personal drama. To be noticed by such a man was to walk a razor's edge. To be ignored was to languish in obscurity, a flower withering on the vine. But to be chosen, to be brought into the inner sanctum of his paranoia, was to enter a new, more dangerous phase of the game. For the Jiajing Emperor, the women of his harem were not objects of desire in the conventional sense. They were part of his alchemical experiments. He believed that the vital essence of young virgins could be harvested to fuel his own longevity. This twisted fantasy, born of his terror of death, had transformed the imperial bedchamber from a place of intimacy into a site of systematic cruelty. The helpless victim was not just one woman, but hundreds, all trapped in the web of his pathological obsession. Your turn came on a cold autumn night. A senior eunuch arrived at your quarters, his face impassive, and uttered the words that every concubine both longed for and dreaded. "The Emperor summons you." The preparation was a frantic, ritualized affair. You were bathed again, your body perfumed, your hair arranged in an elaborate style. You were dressed in layers of the finest silk, each one a whisper-thin barrier against the cold and the unknown. As you were led through the silent, moonlit courtyards, the silence itself seemed to scream. You were taken to the Palace of Heavenly Purity, the Emperor's private residence. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense and unknown chemicals, a testament to his ongoing quest for eternal life. The Emperor was waiting, not in his bed, but in a chamber filled with bronze vessels and charts of the constellations. He was older than you had imagined, his face a mask of pale powdered skin, his eyes dark, restless pools of suspicion. He did not look at you with lust, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen. He spoke of the balance of yin and yang, of the life force, the qi, that resided within you. His words were a confusing jumble of Taoist philosophy and paranoid delusion. He believed that by coupling with young virgins without emission, he could absorb their yin essence, thereby strengthening his own yang and prolonging his life. The act itself was a cold, clinical procedure, devoid of any semblance of passion or connection. You were a vessel, a living ingredient in his grotesque recipe for immortality. The experience was profoundly dehumanizing, a violation that went deeper than the physical. It was an assault on your very essence, your life force treated as a commodity to be consumed. Afterwards, you were dismissed, sent back to your quarters in the pre-dawn chill, your body aching, your mind a maelstrom of confusion and shame. This became your new reality. You were summoned periodically, another girl in a long line of girls, all feeding the Emperor's insatiable fear of his own mortality. You were elevated in rank to noble lady, a promotion that brought with it a larger room, finer clothes, and the simmering jealousy of your rivals. The promotion was not a reward, it was a mark. It meant you were now a more significant part of the Emperor's bizarre ritual, your proximity to him making you both a target and a tool. The psychological torture was relentless. You lived in a state of constant anxiety, your days measured by the arrivals and departures of the eunuchs, your nights filled with the dread of the next summons. You saw the toll it took on the other girls. Some grew withdrawn and silent, their eyes hollow, their spirits broken. Others became brittle and cruel, turning their own suffering outwards, lashing out at those below them. It was a masterclass in systematic cruelty, a system designed to break the human spirit, to turn women against each other, to ensure that the only power in this world belonged to the man at its center. The palace was a closed ecosystem of intrigue, and alliances were the only currency that mattered. You learned this lesson the hard way. Your elevation in rank, while seemingly a blessing, had painted a target on your back. The other concubines, particularly those who had been in the palace longer and had yet to receive the Emperor's favor, saw you as an obstacle. Their smiles became sharper, their polite inquiries laden with hidden barbs. The most dangerous of these was Consort Duan, a woman whose beauty was as formidable as her ambition. She had been in the palace for 5 years and had borne the Emperor a daughter, a fact that granted her significant status but fell short of the ultimate prize, a son. She saw the Emperor's interest in you, however clinical and strange, as a direct threat to her own position. Her jealousy was a palpable force, a cold poison that seeped into every interaction. She began to orchestrate a subtle campaign against you. A precious hairpin, a gift from the Emperor, went missing from your room, only to be found in the possession of your personal maid, who was then brutally beaten for a theft she did not commit. A rumor began to circulate that you were secretly practicing witchcraft to ensnare the Emperor, a dangerous accusation in a court already steeped in superstition and paranoia. You felt yourself being slowly, methodically isolated, the invisible walls of the forbidden city closing in on you. You realized you could not survive alone. Your only hope was to find a protector, someone with enough power to shield you from Consort Duan's machinations. That protector came in the unlikely form of a eunuch named Wei. Wei was one of the senior eunuchs, a man who had served the Jiajing emperor for over 20 years. He was a complicit system enforcer, his hands stained with the quiet cruelties of the court, but he was also a pragmatist. He had seen countless concubines rise and fall, and he understood the delicate balance of power better than anyone. He saw in you not just another pretty face, but a potential asset. You were young, you had the emperor's attention, and you were, in his estimation, intelligent enough to be useful. He approached you one evening, his voice a soft rasp in the twilight of your small garden. He did not offer friendship, he offered a transaction. He would protect you, guide you, and ensure your continued favor with the emperor. In return, you would be his eyes and ears, reporting to him the whispers and secrets of the women's quarters. It was a deal with the devil, a step deeper into the moral ambiguity of the palace. But it was a deal you could not refuse. Your survival depended on it. Under Wei's tutelage, you learned to play the game with a new level of sophistication. He taught you how to turn your rival's schemes against them, how to plant whispers of your own, how to feign weakness to lure your enemies into a trap. You became a student of psychological warfare, your innocence a carefully crafted mask. You learned to use the emperor's own paranoia to your advantage. Knowing his fear of poison, you made a great show of tasting your own food before it was served. A subtle performance of loyalty that played directly to his anxieties. You cultivated an air of serene, almost spiritual purity, positioning yourself not as a creature of ambition, but as another component of his quest for immortality, a willing and selfless contributor to his well-being. It was a twisted, exhausting performance, a constant battle to suppress your own revulsion and fear. You were becoming one of them, your humanity eroding with each calculated smile, each feigned submission. The girl named Lin was now just a faint, ghostly memory, a casualty of your will to survive in this beautiful, monstrous place. The emperor's obsession with Taoist alchemy began to escalate, his behavior growing more erratic and his demands more dangerous. His quest for the elixir of life had led him to believe that he needed to consume a special kind of pill, one made from the menstrual blood of virgins mixed with powdered pearls and other exotic ingredients. This perverted ingenuity marked a new, horrifying chapter in the lives of the palace women. A decree was issued. A select group of the youngest concubines, girls between the ages of 13 and 16, were to be chosen for this specific purpose. They were to be housed in the Palace of Eternal Spring, their diet strictly controlled to ensure the purity of their vital fluids. They were forbidden from eating anything but mulberry leaves and rainwater, a diet designed to keep them weak and docile. They became, in essence, a human herd, cultivated for a single, grotesque harvest. You were spared this particular fate, being slightly too old, but you were forced to witness its implementation, a chilling spectacle of the emperor's metastasizing psychosis. You saw the terror in the eyes of the chosen girls, some of whom you had considered friends, as they were led away. They were the ultimate helpless victims, their bodies transformed into living laboratories for the emperor's twisted fantasy. The palace physicians, once men of healing, were now complicit system enforcers of the highest order, their medical knowledge repurposed to serve the emperor's madness. They oversaw the collection of the red lead, as it was euphemistically called, their faces grim and impassive as they carried out their grotesque duties. The atmosphere in the Forbidden City grew darker, the air thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. The systematic cruelty had reached a new peak. The girls in the Palace of Eternal Spring were slowly starving, their bodies wasting away, their spirits crushed. Whispers of their suffering spread through the women's quarters, tales of fainting spells, of weeping that echoed through the halls at night, of a despair so profound it was like a physical illness. Consort Duan, ever the opportunist, saw this new development as a chance to solidify her own power. She became a vocal proponent of the emperor's alchemical pursuits, praising his wisdom and devotion. She took it upon herself to help oversee the project, her cruelty finding a new, officially sanctioned outlet. She would visit the Palace of Eternal Spring, her face a mask of false sympathy, and berate the starving girls for their lack of devotion, accusing them of impurities if they so much as cried out in their hunger. She was a monster created by a monstrous system, her own insecurities and ambitions twisted into a weapon of abuse. Your eunuch protector Wei warned you to stay away, to feign ignorance, to focus solely on maintaining the emperor's favor. It was pragmatic advice, the only sane advice in an insane world, but it gnawed at you. To do nothing was to be complicit, to allow your own survival to be purchased at the cost of the suffering of others. The moral compromises were piling up, each one a heavy stone on your conscience. You had learned to play the game, but you were beginning to realize that there were no winners, only different degrees of loss. The breaking point came, as it so often does, not with a grand explosion, but with a single, desperate act. One of the girls in the Palace of Eternal Spring, a young woman named Liana who had arrived at the palace in the same group as you, could bear the torment no longer. Liana was a quiet, gentle soul, known for her skill in playing the zither, her music a rare source of genuine beauty in the stifling atmosphere of the court. But the starvation, the constant medical procedures, and the psychological terror had broken her. One night, in a fit of despair, she hanged herself from the rafters of her small room with her own silk sash. Her death was not treated as a tragedy, but as an inconvenience, an impurity that had contaminated the emperor's sacred project. Her body was removed unceremoniously, her existence erased as if she had never been. But her suicide sent a shockwave through the women's quarters. It was a stark, undeniable testament to the horror of their situation. The unspoken despair that had been simmering beneath the surface now had a name, a face, a tragic finality. For a small group of concubines, Liana's death was not just a tragedy, it was a catalyst. Led by a woman named Yang Jinying, a concubine who had been a close friend of Liana's, a desperate, unthinkable plot began to form. They were going to kill the emperor. It was a suicide mission, a mad gamble born of absolute desperation. But in their eyes, it was the only path left. They were helpless victims no more. They were choosing to fight back, even if it meant certain death. The conspiracy was a thing of whispers and stolen glances, a fragile web of trust in a world where trust was a fatal liability. They knew they could not use poison. The emperor's food was too carefully guarded. They decided on a more direct, more intimate method: strangulation. They would wait until he was asleep, in the deep, opium-induced slumber that often followed his alchemical rituals, and they would use the silk cords from the palace lanterns to end his life. The plan was breathtaking in its audacity and its folly. They were a handful of starving, traumatized girls against the most powerful man on earth, a man protected by a legion of guards and eunuchs. Yet their resolve was absolute. They had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, and in their shared suffering, they had found a strange, terrible courage. They chose a night when the emperor was scheduled to visit the quarters of Consort Duan. This was a calculated risk. Duan's ambition made her a potential ally, but her cruelty also made her a potential betrayer. The conspirators, led by Yang Jinying, decided they had no choice but to try and recruit her. They believed that her own precarious position, her failure to produce a male heir, might make her desperate enough to join their cause. The approach was made, a whispered proposition in a darkened corridor. Consort Duan's reaction was not what they had hoped for. She did not agree, but more terrifyingly, she did not refuse. She listened, her face a perfect, unreadable mask, and then dismissed them with a wave of her hand, leaving them in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Had she joined them, or would she betray them? Their lives now hung on the whim of a woman they knew to be ruthless and self-serving. The night of the planned assassination arrived, thick with a suffocating tension. The conspirators, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering lamplight, gathered their silk cords, their hands trembling but their eyes filled with a grim determination. They moved through the palace like ghosts, their soft slippers making no sound on the polished floors. They knew the layout of the emperor's private chambers, the routines of the guards, the moments of vulnerability in the otherwise impenetrable fortress of his security. Their greatest obstacle, and their greatest hope, was Consort Duan. They did not know if she would help them gain access to the sleeping emperor, or if she had already sounded the alarm, and they were walking into a trap. As they approached the emperor's chambers, they saw a sight that made their blood run cold. Consort Duan was waiting for them, but she was not alone. Standing with her was Wei, your eunuch protector, his face as impassive as ever. For a moment, the conspirators froze, convinced they had been betrayed. But then Duan gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and Wei stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter the emperor's bedchamber. It was a stunning, terrifying moment of truth. Both Duan and Wei, The ultimate pragmatists, the ultimate survivors, had made a calculated decision. They knew the emperor's madness was becoming a liability. His neglect of state affairs, his squandering of the treasury on his quest for immortality, and his increasingly erratic behavior were destabilizing the court. They saw this desperate, suicidal plot not as a solution, but as an opportunity, a chaotic event they could potentially manipulate to their own advantage. They were not joining the conspiracy. They were allowing it to happen, ready to pick up the pieces whichever way they fell. The girls slipped into the chamber. The Jiajing emperor was asleep on his grand bed, the scent of opium heavy in the air. For a moment, they hesitated, looking at the man who was the source of all their misery. He looked so small, so fragile in his sleep, a mere mortal stripped of his imperial aura. But then the memory of Liena, of their own suffering, hardened their resolve. They threw the silk cord around his neck and pulled. But in their haste and their terror, they made a fatal mistake. They tied a simple knot, not a slip knot. As they pulled, the knot tightened, cutting off his breath, but it did not kill him quickly. The emperor, his face purpling, his eyes bulging, began to thrash. His muffled gasps a horrifying sound in the silent room. Panic erupted. The girls, their plan going horribly wrong, pulled with all their might, but the knot held fast. In the chaos, one of the younger girls, terrified by the violent struggle, lost her nerve. She turned and fled, screaming, her cries shattering the stillness of the night and sealing their fate. The guards, alerted by the screams, burst into the room. The scene they found was one of grotesque, nightmarish violence. The emperor was unconscious, barely breathing, a silk cord embedded in his neck, surrounded by a group of terrified, struggling concubines. The conspirators were captured immediately. The palace erupted into chaos. The empress, a formidable woman who had long been sidelined by the emperor's Taoist obsessions, arrived on the scene. She saw at once the gravity of the situation. While the emperor lay unconscious, she took control. She ordered the palace physicians to do everything in their power to save him. Then, with a cold, swift efficiency, she ordered the arrest of every single person involved, or even suspected of being involved, in the plot. The aftermath was a brutal, systematic purge. The empress, seizing the opportunity to eliminate her rivals and restore a semblance of order to the court, acted with ruthless precision. The 16 conspirators, led by Yang Jinying, were subjected to the death by 1,000 cuts, a gruesome, prolonged execution reserved for the most heinous of crimes. Their bodies were dismembered, their families executed to the 9th degree, their names cursed for eternity. The punishment was a spectacle of state-sponsored terror, a clear and brutal message to anyone who would ever dare to challenge the authority of the Son of Heaven. Consort Duan, the woman who had stood on the precipice of the conspiracy, was also arrested. Despite her last-minute decision to alert the empress, her initial hesitation, her failure to stop the plot immediately, was deemed an act of treason. She was condemned, her ambition and her cruelty leading her to the same fate as the women she had tormented. Her story became another cautionary tale, a testament to the fact that in the Forbidden City, no one was safe. Wei, the eunuch, in a masterful act of self-preservation, managed to escape the purge. He claimed that he had been trying to stop the conspirators, that he was on his way to alert the guards when the chaos erupted. In the confusion, with the key players dead, his version of events was accepted. He remained a senior figure in the court, a silent, watchful survivor who had navigated the treacherous currents and emerged, once again, unscathed. And you were caught in the web. One of the captured girls, under torture, had mentioned your name, speaking of your quiet sympathy for their plight. It was a flimsy accusation, but in the atmosphere of paranoia and retribution that gripped the palace, it was enough. You were arrested, thrown into the cold, damp cells of the palace prison. You were interrogated for days, the questions relentless, the threats veiled but terrifying. You were a helpless victim once more, your fate hanging by a thread, dependent on the whims of those in power. It was Wei who saved you. He intervened on your behalf, speaking to the empress, vouching for your loyalty. He painted you as a simple, naive girl, incapable of such a complex and treasonous plot. He argued that you were a favorite of the emperor, and that your death would displease him when he recovered. It was a calculated appeal, playing to the empress's desire to maintain stability and her respect for the emperor's authority, however compromised. His intervention worked. You were released, cleared of all suspicion, and returned to your quarters. You had survived, but you were not the same. The experience had stripped away the last vestiges of your innocence. You had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back into you. You understood now, with a chilling clarity, the true nature of the world you inhabited. It was a world built on a foundation of systematic cruelty, where survival was a matter of luck, cunning, and a willingness to make impossible moral compromises. The Jiajing emperor eventually recovered, though the assassination attempt left him even more paranoid and reclusive than before. He never spoke of the incident, and a veil of silence was drawn over the so-called Palace Women's Uprising. The official record was sanitized, the event reduced to a footnote, a brief, inexplicable moment of madness. The emperor retreated even further into his world of alchemy and superstition, his fear of death now a raging inferno. He became a virtual prisoner in his own palace, rarely seen, his edicts delivered by the eunuchs, who now held even more power than before. Your own position, paradoxically, was strengthened by the turmoil. In the eyes of the recovering emperor, you were one of the few who had remained pure, untainted by the treason that had swept through the women's quarters. Your survival was seen as a testament to your loyalty, a perception carefully cultivated by Wei. You were elevated again, this time to the rank of imperial consort, one of the highest positions in the harem. You were given a vast, beautiful courtyard of your own, a legion of servants, and access to wealth and luxury beyond your wildest dreams. But it was all hollow, a beautiful, empty shell. The luxury was a cage, the servants were spies, and the wealth was a constant reminder of the price you had paid. You lived in a state of quiet, perpetual dread. The ghosts of Liena, Yang Jinying, and even consort Duan, your constant companions. You played the part required of you. You were the serene, devoted consort, a calming presence for a deeply damaged and dangerous man. You participated in his bizarre rituals, offering him your qi not with the terror of a young girl, but with the detached resignation of a long-term survivor. You had mastered the art of dissociation, the ability to separate your mind from your body, to retreat into an inner sanctum where the girl named Lin still existed, however faintly. You watched as the years passed, as new girls arrived at the palace, their faces filled with the same mixture of hope and fear that you once had. You saw them enter the same cycle of training, competition, and dehumanization. You were now one of the senior concubines, one of the women that the new arrivals looked upon with a mixture of awe and terror. You could see the questions in their eyes. How had you survived? What terrible compromises had you made? You offered them no answers, no comfort. To do so would be to endanger yourself, to break the cardinal rule of survival. You had become a complicit system enforcer, your silence a necessary betrayal of your own past, of your own gender. You were part of the machine that had crushed you. The only act of rebellion left to you was small, secret, and intensely personal. In the quiet of your luxurious prison, you would practice your calligraphy, the one art form that brought you a measure of peace, but you did not write the elegant, approved poetry of the court. Instead, you would write the names of the dead girls, Liena, Jinying, and all the others whose stories had been erased. You would write them over and over again, the black ink bleeding into the delicate rice paper, a silent, secret memorial to the forgotten victims of this gilded cage. The years bled into one another, each one marked by the same suffocating routine, the same quiet desperation. The emperor grew older, his body weaker, his obsession with immortality more frantic and pathetic. The elixirs that were supposed to grant him eternal life were, in fact, poisoning him. The heavy metals and toxic minerals he consumed with such devotion were slowly destroying him from within. His skin took on a deathly pallor, his hands trembled, and his paranoia deepened into a state of near-constant delirium. He was a dying man, consumed by the fear of the very thing his actions had hastened. You watched his decline with a strange, detached pity. He was a monster, the architect of your misery and the misery of countless others, but in his final years you saw him for what he truly was, a deeply flawed, terrified man, a dysfunctional tyrant whose cruelty was born from his own profound weakness. He was as much a prisoner of the system as you were, trapped by the impossible expectations of his divine role, haunted by the specter of his own mortality. His death, when it finally came, was as quiet and anticlimactic as his life had been tumultuous. He slipped away in his sleep, his long, destructive reign ending not with a bang, but with a whimper. The news of his death sent a tremor through the Forbidden City, but it was a tremor of uncertainty, not of grief. A new emperor, his son, would ascend the dragon throne, and the entire complex ecosystem of the court would be thrown into a state of flux. For the surviving concubines of the Jiajing emperor, his death was not a liberation. According to ancient tradition, the concubines who had not borne the deceased emperor a son were expected to follow him in death. Some would be granted the honor of committing suicide, given a silken cord or a vial of poison. Others, less fortunate, would be buried alive in his massive tomb, their ghostly screams silenced by tons of earth and stone, doomed to serve him in the afterlife as they had in life. It was the system's final, brutal act of possession. Your fate, however, was different. Wei, ever the master of the long game, had anticipated this. Years earlier, he had arranged for you to be officially declared the adoptive mother of one of the emperor's younger sons, a boy born to a low-ranking concubine who had died in childbirth. It was a political maneuver, a way for Wei to secure his own influence with the future emperor. But for you, it was a lifeline. As the mother of a prince, you were spared the tomb. You were granted the title of dowager consort, and given a place in the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility, the traditional residence for the widows of past emperors. You had survived. You had outlasted the tyrant, the rivals, the conspiracies. You had won the game. But as you moved into your new, quiet residence, you felt no sense of victory. Your life had been a long, slow sacrifice. You had given up your name, your family, your youth, your humanity, all for the prize of survival. And what was your reward? A larger, more luxurious cage where you would live out the rest of your days in quiet, respectable obscurity, a living relic of a dead man's reign. In the quiet solitude of the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility, the ghosts of your past were your most constant companions. The silence of your elegant courtyard was a stark contrast to the psychological noise of your life in the inner court. Here, there were no more schemes to navigate, no more rivals to outwit, no more terrifying summons in the middle of the night. There was only the slow, inexorable passage of time. You were a living monument to a bygone era, your presence a constant, if silent, reminder of the Jiajing emperor's long and troubled reign. The new emperor, a young and vigorous man, was busy consolidating his own power, purging the court of his father's corrupt Taoist advisors and installing his own loyalists. The world moved on, leaving you and the other dowagers behind, forgotten figures in a new chapter of history. You spent your days in quiet contemplation, tending to your small garden, practicing your calligraphy, and reading the Buddhist scriptures that spoke of detachment and the illusion of the material world. You tried to find peace, to reconcile the woman you had become with the girl you had once been, but peace was elusive. The scars of your past ran too deep. At night, you would dream of Liana's gentle face, of Yang Jinying's fierce eyes, of the terrified screams of the girls being buried alive in the imperial tomb. You had survived, but you carried the weight of their deaths, the guilt of your own compromises. You were a testament to the profound human cost of a system that treated women as property, as tools, as decorative objects to be used and discarded at will. Your life had been shaped by a series of impossible choices, each one a step further away from your own soul. You had learned the dark arts of survival in a world designed to destroy you, and in doing so, you had lost a part of yourself that you could never reclaim. The secret life of a Chinese concubine was not a story of romance or glamour. It was a story of psychological warfare, of systematic dehumanization, of the quiet, desperate struggle to hold on to one's identity in the face of overwhelming power. It was the story of thousands of women, their names and lives erased by history, their suffering a silent, invisible foundation upon which the grand edifice of empire was built. Your final years were spent in this state of somber, philosophical reflection. You had seen the pinnacle of power and the depths of despair. You had known both the exquisite beauty and the grotesque cruelty of the Forbidden City. And you had come to understand that the true prison was not the high walls of the palace, but the rigid, unforgiving expectations of the world it represented. The gilded cage was not just a place, it was an idea, a system of belief that valued power over people, ambition over empathy, and legacy over life. As you grew old, your beauty fading like the last rays of a winter sunset, you found a strange, bittersweet freedom. You were no longer an object of desire or a political pawn. You were simply a woman, a survivor, a witness. And in the final, quiet moments of your life, you thought of your real name, the name you had been given at birth, the name of a wildflower by a river in the south, Lynn. It was a whisper from a lifetime ago, a final, defiant act of remembering who you were before the world decided who you had to be. The legacy of the Forbidden City is one of architectural splendor and imperial grandeur, a testament to the power and longevity of one of the world's great civilizations. Its soaring roofs, its intricate carvings, its vast, symmetrical courtyards all speak of order, harmony, and the divine mandate of the Son of Heaven. But beneath this veneer of sublime beauty lies a darker, more complex story, a story written in the silent suffering and erased lives of the women who inhabited its inner sanctums. The system of imperial concubinage was a microcosm of the patriarchal power structure that defined not just China, but much of human history. It was a system that institutionalized the objectification of women, reducing them to their reproductive capacity, their aesthetic appeal, and their strategic value in the endless game of politics and succession. The women of the harem were not individuals. They were a collective, a resource, their humanity secondary to their function. Their lives were governed by a rigid hierarchy, a carefully calibrated system of ranks and privileges designed to foster jealousy and competition, to ensure that they would never unite, that their power would always be directed at each other, rather than at the system that imprisoned them. This was the true, perverted ingenuity of the institution. It was a self-policing prison, where the inmates were also the guards. The psychological cost of this existence is almost impossible to imagine. To live in a state of constant surveillance, where any word, any gesture, could be misinterpreted and lead to ruin. To have your entire worth tied to the fleeting, capricious favor of a single man. To see your youth and beauty as your only assets, knowing that they are diminishing with each passing day. To live with the constant threat of violence, not just from the state, but from your own sisters in this shared captivity. It was a life of profound and unrelenting psychological torture, a slow, systematic erosion of the self. The stories that have survived, the whispers of empresses who mutilated their rivals, of concubines who murdered their own children to frame an enemy, of desperate, suicidal rebellions like the one in the Jiajing Emperor's reign, are often presented as sensationalist tales of female hysteria and cruelty. But they are not. They are the predictable, tragic outcomes of a system that pushes human beings to their absolute limits, that strips them of their agency and their dignity, and that leaves them with only the most desperate and brutal tools of survival. The women of the Forbidden City were not inherently monstrous. They were made monstrous by a monstrous system. They were victims who, in their struggle to survive, often became perpetrators themselves, perpetuating the cycle of cruelty that had ensnared them. And for every Empress Wu, Zetian, or Cixi who managed to claw her way to the pinnacle of power, there were thousands upon thousands of Lins and Lienas whose names are lost to history, whose quiet suffering went unrecorded, whose lives were deemed insignificant. Their stories are the true, hidden history of the Forbidden City, a history that challenges us to look beyond the shimmering golden roofs and the majestic halls, and to see the human cost of empire, the silent sacrifices upon which thrones are built. It is a somber, unsettling reflection on the nature of power, and on the resilience and the fragility of the human spirit in the face of systematic oppression.